I must have upset someone at work because on my desk was left this dog poop bag. Kind of like the mafia leaving a horse's head on your pillow. However, once I started to inspect this grave insult, I found that it wasn't any form of insult at all, but rather a thoughtful gift. You see, us mini painters, we'll take little bits of wood and paint them up to look like scaled down bits of wood, and we will take rocks and paint those up to look like miniature scaled down rocks. And someone has given me the thoughtful gift of some rocks, specifically some pieces of slate. And slate is one particular type of rock that I really like. The surface texture works really nicely in scale, and it looks really prominent once painted. As a side note that will become relevant later, this poison assassin model I painted like 3 years ago has been sitting in my pile of shame. Now, most people's pile of shame is the models that they haven't painted yet, but that's my pile of opportunity. My shame pile instead are those models that I have painted but haven't done any basing for. Well, her pose, that powerful step forwards, blade ready at her side, head held high in confidence, she will look awesome standing on the top of a cliff face looking down at her next victim. So, for today, let's make her a really awesome base in the simplest way. As these rocks came from that horrible place known as, I think it's called the Outdoors, I'm going to give them a quick clean, and this is just to make sure that the dirt doesn't stop the paint from sticking to the rock itself. And just to show how much dirt came off of this kind of small handful of rocks, yeah. Once the slate pieces had dried off, I picked the one I wanted for my assassin, and I wanted to make sure that it would have a flat top surface, or kind of at least flat-ish. I quickly realised that the size of the piece of slate that I had chosen was quite large, and I ended up having to go all the way to a 40mm base to put underneath it. And I'm sure people are crying about what base size is needed for certain games and certain models, but this model is never going to be used in its intended game, so that's really of no concern. I mixed up a big old blob of milliput and propped the slate above it, pressing it down and aiming for the outcrop where my model will stand to end up flat. And I didn't quite manage it to be perfectly flat, but it is close enough and it worked out in the end. I also filled in the sides around the base to make it look like the mud around the rock was a natural formation of a hillside. As we'll see later on, that wasn't necessarily the best idea, and I would have preferred to have a little bit more of a step with a flat surface underneath. To make sure everything stays nice and strong, I'm adding a little bit of super glue and baking powder, and this will add a little bit of texture as well. With that set and primed in grey, I set about painting it purple. Stick with me, purple. This bright saturation going on now will be muted a lot in a few moments, so don't worry too much. But the colour tones of the model, kind of the strong greens and blue with that accent of purple in her hair, I felt that purple is going to be the perfect shadow colour for her base. And so I went round the slate and I painted that purple on all of the sideways and facing undersides of any of the outcrops. And that will allow for these areas to appear the darkest, but also have a subtle hue of purple that's going to be more visually interesting than just black and grey. To contrast this, the larger open flat surfaces got a slightly less saturated green. At first I felt like this would imply some moss, although that didn't really turn out in the end, but I quickly realised that green might not be the right colour for me, because purple is red and blue, and the opposite of that on the colour wheel is going to actually be yellow. And so before the green had really dried, I yeeted some yellow over the top of it, and it reminds me of just how much I like wet blending. I should try that some more. I said earlier that I'll be muting all the colours, and that starts now. The entire base is going to be darkened first with a black wash, and then highlighted up with a grey dry brush. Both of these two techniques are referred to as messy techniques, certainly I refer to them that way. But in the case of terrain or model's base, that is perfect to encourage the natural variation in tones and value, which will bring in visual texture along with the physical texture of the slate. And the dry brush, especially as the last step, brings out the physical texture of the rock really nicely. And I said earlier that slate is one of my favourites to paint in scale because of how dry brushing picks out that texture. And you can achieve a very strong artistic feel or a more realistic look for not a lot of effort. I also gave the mud texture a little bit of a dry brush of ochre, and at this point I was just loving how it was looking, and I jumped ahead a step and glued the model onto the outcrop. Oh yeah, that's awesome. Really what I wanted, kind of the right feeling that I was going for. Powerful assassin standing on a cliff. But that one step that I skipped, thankfully, is going to be really easy to work around the model, so it's not much of an issue. Now, I got these electric blue grass tufts a while back because I thought I'd end up making some sci-fi army from an alien world or like a skirmish game, kind of fire team or something, and I haven't ended up doing that. But this model is the perfect excuse to use some of them, especially as it complements the blue on the model. I like to cut tufts like these, as the larger size doesn't always fit the scale of the models that I'm working with, and in this case, cutting them into thin strips let me tuck them underneath the little crags of the slate. And the one last little touch, something I don't usually do, is to name a character. A powerful assassin ready to wreak havoc, anticipating the storm of violence she's about to unleash. Viharosh. And yes, I tucked the name under the outcrop because my handwriting is just as bad as my brushwork. I really love slate for miniature painting. They look fantastic, the texture works perfectly in scale, and you can lean into different directions with colour and style or realistic effects. But this one is finished, looking badass and with a base that fits the style of the model perfectly. A simple project, but a success. So I can say, I'm ED-SKaR, always will be, and thank you very much for watching.